As you may have seen, Kestra now has support for SDKs in JavaScript, Python, Go, and Java. This provides a convenient way for being able to interact with Kestra's API directly inside of these programming languages. This means you can now build custom applications on top, or if you're coming from a background where your orchestration system was in Python, for example, now you can bridge the gap between what Kestra has to offer and what you're used to in a Python orchestration world. I'm going to walk you through how to get set up with the Python SDK and how we can start building our first integration. So first of all, the SDK is completely open source. So if you find any issues with it or you want to change something, then you can open an issue or make a pull request and you can see it all here. And as you can see here, this is the SDK. It's still in beta. So again, if there's any bugs, let us know. And as you can see, there are 4 different SDKs. Now, if we click into the Python one for a second here, we'll get some installation instructions. But if we go down a little bit further, we'll get the documentation for what you can actually do with this SDK. The SDK mimics our API. So if you're familiar with our API or if you haven't, you can jump to the API reference here and have a look at what's available. There are a bunch of different operations that you can do, all to do with flows, templates, executions, logs, plugins, etc., etc. And as you can see here, a lot of that has been translated into methods you can now use in Python. So we can see a lot of that similarity. So if we scroll down a little bit, we can see executions here. I can see files, flows. So we're going to have a look at how we can get this set up on our own machine so we can start interacting with our Kestra instance. So we're going to need to get this SDK set up in an environment. Now I'm using UV as my Python package manager here. So I'm just going to go to my new folder here, video, and then I'm going to just do UV VM. So it's going to create me a virtual environment here inside of my folder, and then I can just activate it here. Yep. And then I can just activate it there by using this command like so. Now I'm going to install the Python SDK from that Git repository, so I can use a command a bit like this that's going to take that and it's going to use the subdirectory Python SDK. So UV is going to install that for me next. So, and then the last thing that we need to do is just install python.env so that we can create a .env file where we can store the Kestra host URL, the username and password. So just going to install that as well. So now we've done that, let me create my .env file. So just create a .env like so. My env file looks a little bit like this. I've got my Kestra host here, my Kestra username and my Kestra password. Set these up and then what we can do is create our first Python file and start writing some code. I've now got a Python file here called main.py. Now let's just add the dependencies that we need to import so that we can use Kestra. For this example, we're going to need to use the Kestra API client, the .env for being able to get those credentials, and then I'm also going to use OS and JSON for this example. With .env right at the top of your file, typically you need to put in the load .env function here. This just will then run the function to then fetch those environment variables. So anything you've got in the .env file will be available in Python. Now we need to set up the configuration. So we're going to add to our object the host, the username and the password, and we're going to fetch those from the environment variables. So we've now got an configuration object here called configuration. So we're now ready to get started. We can now create an API client using that configuration object and an API instance once we've created that client. So now we can start using some of the methods that we saw here inside of the README. So I want to create a flow. So let's have a quick look at the create flow documentation, and you can find all of this under the docs directory, but you can also just click on the thing. So I'm just going to search here. I want to create a flow. I can click on that. That opens this up and gives me an example. We can see that configuration object, and we can see here that if you are using maybe Enterprise Edition with API tokens, you can use a bearer token too. When we make a request, we do need to pass in a tenant ID. So I'm just going to create a tenant and I'm going to call it main because that is the name of the tenant on open source. If you're on the Enterprise Edition, make sure you use the same tenant ID that you have that you're using there. I also want to create a flow ID. I'm going to just call this video like it suggested, and we also want a namespace, which I'm going to just call a demo for this example. Now for this request, we need to provide it a body with our flow. So here's just a simple flow where I can use Python f strings here to be able to pass in the flow ID and the namespace. And it's just a simple log flow that I'm going to pass in from the SDK. So we've got all our logic here, and I'm going to add this straight from Python without having to make the API request myself using the request library or something similar. Now looking at the documentation, we need to use use our instance.createFlow, pass it the tenant and the body, and we should be good to go. So let's start doing that now. So here I've been able to create my API response using the API instance.createFlow, passed it the tenant and the body, and then I'm going to get it to print out the API response. So now that I've got this all set up, I'm going to create my new flow inside of Kestra. I can do uv run main.py, and that should then print out the response, which we can see here. It's just printed that out to say that it has successfully created it. If we pop back over to Kestra here, we can actually open up what we called it video, and we can see right at the bottom here, Kestra now has a new flow called video, which is exactly what we expected. If I now run this workflow, I can get an execute. So there we've got an execution. So now I'm going to use the executions API to be able to get information about the last execution we made. Now, if we head over to Kestra, we can just see that I made 3 different executions. They've got different IDs here. I'm going to take that last ID. I've pasted it in here under execution ID, and I can pass that here, and it's going to print it out using pretty print here. So it's a little bit easier to read. So if we run that and make that terminal a little bit bigger, we can see here, it has in fact fetched the information. We can see the different statuses and whatnot. Great example if you are using Python to be able to digest information about your executions. You can now use the SDK to achieve that rather than having to go through the route of maybe doing something with requests or another sort of API request library to make those requests manually. Now you can just create a configuration object, pass it to which part of the API you want to use, and then you can just call the methods as you need. I can't wait to hear what you're going to build with the Kestra SDK. Let us know in the description what you'd love to see from this SDK in the future, and if there's any other content or tutorials you'd like to see.